as enormously powerful missile strikes now initiated the invasion at sea, along with strikes against American military shipping from the very potent and advanced underwater use on loitering munitions, which in effect were able to attack not just surface ships but subs, as these were the first of their kind as far as an undersea loitering munition, as there had already been surface based loitering munitions for some time, with the YJ-21 hypersonic anti-ship missiles coming in and slamming both the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard vessels, as well as even the logistical vessels that belong to the U.S. Military Sealift Command. All of these vessels being struck near instantaneously opened up this savage invasion within the Beaumont / Port Arthur battle space, as well as also the Type 55 or in high-class cruisers, as there were four dividing their attention between both the Houston and Beaumont battle spaces. There were also the four Yuan class Type 039A submarines, which also launched massive cruise missile strikes, and these vessels were supported by the Type 903 complete logistical vessel, which was able to not only refuel these vessels, but also rearm them with missiles and other types of ammunition and supplies. As these strikes would continue throughout the course of the operation, as the initial strikes struck the sea-based targets and some land targets, the rest of the strikes would then gradually focus on land targets, as many bridges would be destroyed, as there were many canals and tributaries that crisscrossed the entire Beaumont / Port Arthur battle space, and as many of these road and street bridges throughout the area would be struck by a combination of YJ-18A and B cruise missiles fired by both the submarines and guided missile cruisers at sea of the PLAN, the air assault forces, along with the recon forces of the PLAN 6th Marine Brigade, as well as even the combat engineers, would all be the first to make landfall of the PLAN 6th Marine Brigade, as these forces of the combat engineers would send their first company of troops in rubber motor rafts that would effectively capture the port facilities in the city of Port Arthur without having to fire a shot, as the massive confusion of the tandem anti-SAT cyber strikes and now the use of electronic warfare assets in the area, such as the PLAN Y9LG aircraft, which was a dual-purpose electronic attack aircraft, electronic warfare, and electronic intelligence aircraft. The Renhai-class guided missile cruisers also had very potent electronic warfare capabilities and blanketed much of the battle space alongside of the incoming Y9LG at the opening of the invasion, as these capabilities would jam redundant systems such as radio communications and portable radars, which were generator-powered and not connected to satellite or internet, and thus were not affected by the tandem anti-SAT cyber strikes. The electronic warfare capabilities were in the area in order to effectively nullify these redundant communication and ISR capabilities, as missiles began to fly in and strike many of these bridges and some other types of targets to support some of the landings, such as that of the Recon Battalion, and eventually supporting the three ground-based companies that were initially landed in the north to capture the State Highway 96 bridge area to prevent exit from the city and entry by the U.S. Marines, which they attacked in short order. The missiles would effectively be flying in to the city to continue to hit bridges and other types of targets, as the air assault forces would fly in a horseshoe pattern, dropping off their forces to capture the 96 bridge, which would end up being the only way into and out of the city from the north, as well as landing their remaining two air assault infantry companies, which were the last two ground-based companies, to capture the absolutely vital I-10 bridge in the southwest of the city. And they would hold this bridge for the entirety of the first day, with many counterattacks being launched, mostly from the outside of the city to the southwest west, with some minor attacks coming from within the city itself, within its outskirts. These forces would hold their position and would end up being supported by very powerful PLAN and also PLAAF and VVS assets, as the VVS, with their very powerful Su-34 strike aircraft, were already exceedingly busy striking various targets within the opening of the invasion, predominantly inland, to support the landings of the PLAN Marine forces. There were instances where the PLAAF's fighter aircraft, as they had two full J-10 squadrons, would aid in airstrikes, while their predominant operations were effectively air superiority operations, as they were predominantly armed with air-to-air weaponry at this time. They still had limited numbers of laser-guided precision munitions in the form of typically 2 per aircraft to strike ground targets if absolutely necessary. And in the case of the initial landings of PLAN Marine Air Assault Infantry troops at the I-10 bridge crossing in the southwest of the city, the VVS would eventually, after conducting its initial strikes, be able to support the PLAN operations, although initially the first airstrike would come from a single J-10 fighter dropping its 2 laser-guided precision munitions on a building that effectively was harboring armed reactionary civilians trying to fire at the incoming Z-18 utility helos of the Transportation Aviation Company of the Air Assault Battalion, as they flew at treetop level, low and fast, and they bobbed and weaved to avoid any types of ground-based fire. Eventually, they would have to slow down, reaching their LZ to drop their troops off, and thus a powerful airstrike would come in from a single J-10 to effectively eliminate this particular dilemma that had arisen, as they were supporting the landing operation in the securing of the LZ in order to fully drop off the last 2 remaining air assault infantry companies, and there would be follow-up supply drops from these Z-18 utility helos of the Air Assault Battalion's Transport Aviation Company, as the Combat Aviation Company would be in the north for the majority of its flight time, supporting operations against the U.S. Marine Corps forces in the area. They would provide heavy fire support along with the ground-based fire support asset, effectively the 82 millimeter mortar company of the Air Assault Battalion, both lobbing mortars and ATGMs and 23 millimeter fire at ground targets, which were comprised of the Alpha Company of the 1st of the 123rd Marine Battalion, which was a reserve battalion belonging to the 4th Marine Division, and they were local to this area of southeast Texas and southwest Louisiana, as these forces would also be fired upon by the HJ-08 ATGMs from above. They would be fired at by very powerful 23 millimeter fire from the attack helo gunships, as well as also the 82 millimeter mortars that were coming in from the ground, like in this particular image where this ACV, or amphibious combat vehicle, which had replaced the older AAV, which was track-based, was being effectively fired upon as it rolled through the area with dismounted Marines in tow trying to lay down fire against a PLAN Marine platoon that was conducting a reconnaissance in force against the U.S. Marines, being again supported by their Z-9WA gunships, as well as their own 82 millimeter mortar company, and powerful airstrikes coming in initially from 2 of the 12 available Su-34 strike aircraft. Each one of these strike aircraft capable of carrying a whopping 26,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions, making it even more heavy-duty than the already very powerful Chinese JH-7, which could carry about 20,000 square pounds of air-to-ground munitions. These VVS, or Russian Air Force Su-34s, would contribute enormously to striking targets throughout the area, including within the city itself, as clusters of armed reactionary civilians would begin to emerge and would need to be dealt with ruthlessly by the coalition aircraft. There would even again be strikes coming in from the limited numbers of air-to-ground munitions aboard some of the J-10 fighters of the two allocated J-10 fighter squadrons of the PLAAF, conducting air superiority operations over the battle space to gain total air control over the forces fighting below in order to ensure that they would not be facing any air threats whatsoever at all from American forces. As the missile strikes came in and annihilated American vessels of the Navy, Coast Guard, and other services, which included the logistical vessels, such as the Frank S. Besson class vessels, transport ships. The fighting was very intense in the north, carried out by the landed air assault infantry forces with their 82mm mortar company supporting them, and the combat aviation company supporting them, as well as also combat erupting along the coast as the 3 LCACs landed the 1st Company from the PLAN 6th Marine Brigade's Reconnaissance Battalion ashore to capture a vital landing site that would be utilized by 2 additional battalions along with the rest of their own. And again, the combat engineers captured the Port Arthur port without even having to fire a shot to begin the heavy landing in this particular landing site of a total of 5 full battalions from the brigade, as the remaining 2 air assault infantry companies would be dropped off to capture the I-10 bridge in the southwest. Fighting in this area would be heavy yet sporadic, as initially, if we go to the map of the area, the fighting would come in different waves, as the armed reactionary civilians would carry out disjointed counterattack type of operations against the PLAN Marine air assault troops that were landed in this particular LZ between 2 canals which ran through this area, as this was a quasi-commercial and industrial area. This contained many building material, road work construction sites, as well as also freight truck sites and the like, as well as also hotels, gas stations, and smaller shops throughout the area, as the I-10 highway bridge effectively crossed both of these canals. These air assault PLAN Marines had designated this area between both canals as the best possible landing zone to capture and hold the I-10 bridges, which included the highway bridge itself, plus the access road bridges and a nearby street bridge, which would not be hit by incoming cruise missiles. These 2 YJ-18As fired from a Renhai-class vessel would come in a bit later, as different events happened during different time periods throughout this particular map, as this one battle alone would last a full 3 hours, as different waves of attackers, again as it was disjointed, would come in at different times trying to attack the landed PLAN Marine air assault infantry troops, as there would also be supply drops that would land at this supply landing zone in between both companies. This would be heavily defended by a full platoon from this air assault infantry company, as each of these helos could carry 30 fully equipped and armed troops, each 5 from the flying platoon of each flying platoon from the 3 different flying platoons, as it would only require 2 of the 3 on the follow-up dropping after the first 3 companies had been dropped in the north. These each would drop off a single company in these 2 different landing zones on either side of the highway bridge, with supply drops being followed up a bit later, bringing in more ammunition, MREs, water, etc. to the air assault infantry troops. As again, to support the initial landing operation, a single J-10 fighter dropped two of its precision-guided 1,000-pound munitions on a building that had been effectively commandeered by armed reactionary civilians, as the armed civilians, both in and outside of the building with their parked technicals, were trying to fire at the incoming helos that were flying fast and low and effectively missed, but they were still deemed a threat as they had to slow down in order to drop off each company at the landing zone, and thus this airstrike had been called in through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system as directed by an orbiting CH-4A high-altitude reconnaissance drone, which was actually armed with ATGMs and could even support certain ground operations if needed, while the ISR capabilities of the PLA and coalition more broadly, including the PLAN, had this area under effectively full lockdown as the quadcopter assets that were now being deployed by each and every single solitary squad of each of the three combat platoons of each company were now orbiting the area, running circuits on both sides of the canal, both to the north, to the south, to the west and east, to map the area all in real time as each platoon, with all their different squads, as each squad had their own quadcopter asset, was responsible for running circuits over specific parts of the battle space. As this entire platoon from this company that was being dropped in this LZ would be responsible for the defense of the supply landing zone along this access road, as the squads initially fanned out off five. One would move to this position and take up a wedge formation. Another would move here and take up a line formation, blocking crossing of this bridge in the prone positions to ensure that they could effectively be relatively well protected when taking fire, as there were wooded areas scattered throughout this land that was in between the two canals. Some of these squads used the wooded areas for additional cover as they took up positions along the canal and by some of these wooded areas, and effectively got into line formations along with the initial platoon that was landed in this area, fanning out with one of its squads moving this way, spreading out in a wide wedge, with the other squad forming a wedge here, and the others effectively taking up line positions of the two additional platoons of this entire company that was landed. Again, this platoon would be solely responsible for defending the LZ for the supply drops, while this platoon and this platoon guarded these areas. As the squad initially fanned out here, the squad moved up a bit, this squad moved over here, wide wedge, and these squads moved here and took up line formation positions. As this company was dropped into place, and again, they would have two single-tube versions of the CH-901A loitering munitions apiece, which could either be set on AI target-seeking mode, like the 48-tube TEL version, when it fired 48 of these at a time. These were equipped with fragmentation warheads, as they did not anticipate having to fight heavily armored forces in this area, along with two fired from this company that would be effectively patrolling the highway bridge, while two squads from one of the three combat platoons of this landed company would effectively get up onto the highway itself as the highway gradually inclined into a raised up bridge in this area. They could cross it from the positions on land over a small type of incline, getting on top of it, and they would take up line positions to block this area. Another squad from this same platoon would go under the bridge and come out and hold this area in a wedge. And they would all effectively have fields of fire that all interlocked, overlapped, and they could effectively watch every field of fire that covered this entire area around the bridge, including on top of it, as they would receive a bit later attacks from armed civilians and technicals trying to effectively drive up the highway, firing frantically at the PLAN troops, who would return fire from abandoned or destroyed vehicles on this portion of the highway, taking cover effectively in the prone position or in the kneeling position around these destroyed or abandoned vehicles, and would return fire against the technicals, including with the tube-fired CH-901As assisting in repelling this one particular attack. More would be dropped on a follow-up supply run to continuously supply these troops with these loitering munitions single-tube versions, but for the time being, they initially started with 2 per company. And again, they were equipped relatively heavily in terms of not just their standard small arms, including their QBJ-201 light machine guns, which had an excessively high rate of fire, but also with their rocket-propelled grenades in the form of the Type 69s, as well as also, besides the Type 69s, they were equipped with 35mm tube-fired grenades, as some of the troops carried these grenade tubes like so, as well as also HJ-08 anti-tank guided missiles, which they could fire at vehicle targets or other heavier targets, but these would be used more sparingly, as there were a bit less of these than there were of the Type 69s, which were produced in freakishly high quantities, and there were more than enough of these to go around, and the rockets would continually be dropped off for use by those that operated these particular systems. And as the fighting would again last for several hours in the initial wave of the disjointed counterattack type operations from the armed civilians, the armed civilians would come in both their technicals as well as some attacking on foot throughout this entire particular map, which was a 1.5 mile east-west area by 1 mile north-south battle map. And as the first airstrike carried out by a J-10 fighter, dropping both of its laser-guided precision munitions onto the building target below, as these armed civilians, both in and around the building, had tried to take shots at the incoming helicopters that were dropping off the air assault infantry troops, as again they had to slow down to reach the landing zones. This strike was highly successful and wiped out all those that were in the building and around it, including right here, as some were trying to run at the time out of the area, and they were destroyed, with the 3rd Transport Aviation Company splitting up at this time for the first supply drops after the landings that had occurred both in the north and the southwest were completed. 3 of the Z-18s would bring in an ample supply of 82mm mortars to the 82mm mortar company of the Air Assault Battalion in the north, as well as also crates of ammunition, MREs, and water to supply them, as these supply drops would be continuous throughout the operation on the first day, and as well as others carried out here, as the Transport Aviation Company's first supply drops were carried out by 3 of the Z-18s, again in the north, and 2 in the southwest of the 3rd Flying Platoon of the Transport Aviation Company, as again, these 2 flying platoons had just dropped off the 2 companies of air assault infantry and thus had to return to the Type 075 landing dock, or helicopter carrier, as it was called, that was just off the coast of the Sabine Lake and about to enter the lake now that the operations were underway and American ships had been successfully destroyed early in the operations opening. The returning transport aviation companies, after the first supply drop, which was divvied up between the 3rd company, as it only took 2 to land, the 2 air assault infantry companies in the south, 3 in the north, and the other 2 dropping supplies here, would then also return, and then all 3 transport aviation companies in follow-up supply drops would be able to carry in even more supplies now that all of the troops had effectively been landed at both landing sites, as the landing zones by now had been secured, as the first supply drop was a successful supply drop, again highly defended by this platoon after they had been dropped off at their LZ. The supplies, again, would consist of ample quantities of different ammunition types and also food and water, as the follow-up attacks were now beginning against the air assault infantry troops holding their positions, as armed civilians, including in their technicals, were coming off the roads and trying to drive right up to the canals as they fired frantically, the PLAN Marines were in their prone position, laying down enormous volumes of return fire into the technicals, including with their 35 millimeter grenades, rocket propelled grenades, and rifle and light machine gun fire, and even some general purpose machine gun fire coming from troops with weapons like the Type 67, which was a belt fed general purpose machine gun that fired the 7.62 by 54 millimeter ammunition, which was larger than the standard light machine gun and rifle ammunition, which was 5.8 by 42 millimeter. The heavy weapons, such as the 12.7 millimeter machine guns, were not available to these ground troops, but this again mattered little, as their weapons such as rocket propelled grenades, 35 millimeter tube fired grenades, and even the potent HJ-08 man portable ATGMs were more than enough to contend with their opposition, as again they also had small numbers of the CH-901A loitering munitions that could be used effectively against clusters of dismounts trying to attack, or vehicles even. And again, they would have powerful support from airstrikes initially. As Hour 5 would come around, and they were still holding these positions, they would then receive powerful artillery support from the artillery battalion, as these self-propelled howitzers were relatively mobile and would be able to assist in hitting armed civilian positions as newer groupings of armed civilians tried to attack, and they would be heavily shelled by the PLZ-07 howitzers a bit later in the day, as again, the first attacks that would come against the air assault infantry troops would last 3 hours, as there would be a lull in the fighting. By the time the lull had ended and new attacks would resume, the artillery would contribute massively to this operation carried out by the air assault Marines, infantry Marines. As the second hour had rolled around into the invasion, approximately 15 minutes past 2 a.m., heavy attacks would initiate, coming from technicals rolling up to the canal and coming off the streets, and armed civilians coming out of buildings as they bounded from building to building, as they thought they could do this to avoid the PLA or coalitions or PLANs ISR apparatus. They would fail miserably in this, as they were constantly seen in real time by the quadcopter assets and high altitude assets and even satellite as they moved from building to building. As this area was fully mapped in real time, all the buildings were known within which there had been armed reactionary civilians, although because of how fast they were moving from building to building, it was sometimes difficult to target them with certain assets because they would be in another building momentarily, although in this particular side, in the second hour, 5 technicals full of different numbers of personnel, 3 in this technical, 5 in this one, and 5, 4 in this one, and 8 in this one, would all try to launch an attack against the positions of the air assault infantry Marines from different buildings, firing out of windows at them, and also an attack from the lead technical itself at this street bridge, which failed miserably as it had been lit up heavily by light machine gun fire and rifle fire, as well as a 35 millimeter grenade fired at the vehicle, destroying and shredding up all the personnel that were both in the cab and in the back with ease. Those in the buildings would continue to lay fire down at these troops that were holding the street bridge here, which was close enough to the highway bridges that it was not targeted by any missiles, and also these bridges of the highway and access roads on this side. And as they launched their attack out of these buildings, and the PLAN Marines returned fire, which is the red on these buildings, as they were firing at the windows and areas where they were receiving fire from, including using rocket-propelled grenades and other weapons, the strike that would be called in through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system moments later, in approximately 15 minutes, the strike package would be fully put together and the aircraft would be available to carry it out. 8,000 or 8,000 pounds, which would be 1,000 pounders, air to ground munitions, would be dropped by a single Su-34 conducting this airstrike, and would have a relatively wide spread of their munitions in this area, destroying an uninhabited building, but also wiping these buildings out in the process, as 8,000 pounds showered this area with a high degree of accuracy, as the unguided munitions were still highly accurate, similar to the capabilities of laser precision guided munitions through the use of the Russian SVP-24 computerized bomb sight, which made unguided munitions extremely accurate, but also they had the coordinates given through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system as well. So effectively, the failure rate was almost zero in terms of the actual airstrikes. Even if a lone 1,000 pounder destroyed this building, the rest all hit this particular area with the free fall munitions. And this was highly effective, as later on, two YJ-18A missiles would pass over the area at this time that would be hitting other targets, as cruise missiles had sporadically passed through this area even before the landing of the two companies of air assault infantry marines to hit bridges that were effectively further upstream, as other bridges that were downstream in these canals had already been destroyed. And as this sizable grouping of armed reactionary civilians, numbering a total of 200 attackers that were sporadically attacking this area, would all be annihilated by a combination of heavy firepower being vectored by all these different squads of these different platoons of each company at these attacking forces, shredding up technicals with HJ-08 man portable ATGMs, rocket-propelled grenades that were the anti-armor type, which were highly effective against the technicals and would rip them to shreds, as the anti-personnel rounds were also available for use against clusters of dismounts, as this technical with personnel in it and these armed civilians that were outside of it and around it were all coming out of this parking lot and into this field by this wooded area, and they were being lit up by this squad holding this access road in this position. Again, holding the landing zone for the supply drops was of critical importance, and an entire platoon was effectively devoted to just that operation, while the other two platoons of this company were spread out to control fields of fire in these areas. And this particular company was, despite being somewhat more close together, had a total, almost diamond-like position of fields of fire in multiple different directions. And they, again, were laying down heavy fire across the canal, shredding these vehicles to pieces. While these vehicles tried to attack up the highway, these squads had, again, laid down immense fire on the vehicles from their positions around abandoned and destroyed vehicles that they were using as concealment more than cover, as cover would have required stronger materials. But it was effective for its purpose, and the mutual support from the squads holding their positions along the access road were able to lay down heavy fire in a L-vectored field of fire, as the slight incline protected these forces over here from receiving any fire from these forces, and it was all guided through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, as each squad-level NCO and up had the PDA-like version of the combat data link tablet, which linked them and their squad's position into the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, which plotted their position in real time, not just with the ISR assets orbiting above, but with the actual positioning of the tablets themselves held by the lead NCOs, which plotted the rough positions of the squads through the AI network in real time, enabled them to be guided on their fields of fire and how to vector their fire properly to avoid friendly fire casualties. And this was highly effective and cut down friendly fire casualties to almost zero throughout this entire operation. It was only some of the Tier 3 allies that had a harder time effectively with access to the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, who had to be guided through liaison officers that were Chinese or Russian to help them in the receiving the data from the AI system, that had small incidences of friendly fire, as they operated through radio receiving instruction through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, but through liaison officers, as they did not have the proper hardware to link them into the system, as it required them to have effective combat data link technologies, at least the hardware, to be able to be grafted into the system. And many of these nations were not that far advanced in the coalition, and thus had to be, again, liaison through radio to guide them in their movements and use of weapons. But this took slightly more time than the instantaneous information spread by the second that was received by Chinese and Russian and even Iranian and Pakistani forces who were grafted into the system, as they had the requisite hardware to effectively be grafted into the real-time AI battlefield data processing system of the Sino-Russian coalition. And these forces would be heavily hit by the incoming Su-34 strike, as the initial strikes, having had been concluded, freed up a number of Su-34s of the Su-34 squadron to conduct close air support operations around the battle space. And this close air support operation involved the dropping of a total of 16,000 pounds spread throughout this whole area that would smash all of these technicals full of personnel and the dismounted personnel that were still alive after spreading or exchanging fire with the PLAN infantry troops of the air assault infantry, would all be annihilated in this massive strike. As all these vehicles moving through the area, and some that were already being engaged by the PLAN Marine troops that were in the prone position, firing everything they had at them, would be completely wiped out between a combination of this enormous airstrike and the fire they were already receiving. This group already being totally cut down by interlocking fields of fire of just these two squads alone, as these squads all had interlocking fields of fire and were laying down enormous fire on these forces, as two technicals that moved into this area were completely annihilated by this squad that was in this area. And even this squad that was in a wide wedge was able to return fire to this side as well, as they would also end up having to repel in their wide wedge forces that were moving through this area, as this squad of this platoon would also assist in the vectoring of fire. But initially, this attack had taken place after the landings had successfully concluded, and this attack had already occurred first, as this attack would come in second and completely smash all of these forces in conjunction with the heavy fire being vectored by the PLAN forces that were tearing up these attackers at the time the strike had come in, destroying these before the strike even hit these personnel who were already being engaged, being ripped up, as the dismounts were already being cut down by the heavy volume of small arms fire being vectored against them, and some 35mm grenade fire, some anti-personnel rounds from rocket-propelled grenades, and again, the occasional use of the very heavy HJO-8 ATGM man-portable systems to destroy some of these vehicles, as each company would be resupplied with more of these ATGMs and rocket-propelled grenade ammunition, as the occupation of this area would go on for the entirety of the first day. As these attacks, again, the combination of all of these attacks from both sides of the bridge would occur within a total of 3 hours, as forces moved into this area to attack these PLA forces in a type of counterattack, figuring out through the spreading of messages by foot-based messengers out into the rural areas that there were invaders in the area and that they needed to be dealt with, as again, there was a high proportion of militia-type forces throughout this battle space, as this was effectively a highly ruralized area outside of the two larger cities, the Beaumont and Port Arthur area. The surrounding areas were very ruralized, and there were a lot of militia-type personnel that had formed as a direct result to the criminal elements that had been imported into the nation through the migration crisis. And although they were effective, they would have been effective against criminals, they were not so effective against quasi-elite military air assault troops of the PLAN 6th Marine Brigade, and were also being annihilated by their wide array of powerful supporting systems, such as their Russian allies with their potent Su-34 strike aircraft, their own aircraft of the Chinese PLAAF, the Air Force, capable of carrying out limited strikes, at least at first, until they would return later armed with more air-to-ground munitions after the USAF and naval aviation and marine aviation were totally destroyed by the fifth hour of the invasion, as in fully destroyed. The operation for now would take effectively 5 full hours to get every battalion ashore of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade, as effectively near the entirety of the brigade would be brought ashore, leaving only the Service Support Company and Headquarters Company, the headquarters of the entire brigade, out at sea during the course of this operation, commanding the brigade from at sea. As now, after the initial strike to support the landing had occurred, and the strikes against these buildings had occurred as these forces vectored fire at the attackers on this side, and the attackers that had tried to take the bridge were repulsed, including these forces here, and these technicals racing up the bridge at these two squads holding their positions on the bridge and having support from below from other squads, L-vectored fire. The personnel here being destroyed along with this airstrike completely wiped out the vast majority of these forces on this side of the canals who were attacking, a total of 200 on this side, as this technical had come around through this parking area behind these businesses. They were now being lit up by fire being vectored at them by the air assault Marines, air assault infantry, and they would promptly turn their technical around and flee the area. This was right after this powerful airstrike had occurred, and all this vectoring of fire and exchange of fire from all of these forces had been going on as they had all moved into position to attack the air assault infantry Marines of the 6th Brigade's Air Assault Battalion. Both companies were holding firm and ensuring that their positions could not be overrun from either side of their LZs that they now controlled the bridge from, as these forces had moved into the area and briefly exchanged fire from across the canal, even one with a 50 caliber Barrett sniper rifle, as the civilian-owned version was fired by one of these personnel, and it completely shredded up a PLAN Marine soldier, penetrating through the body armor. The return fire meted out was excessive and heavy, and several of these personnel were ripped to pieces while the rest had fled the area promptly. All of this, of course, after the massive airstrikes and earlier heated exchange of mass fire across the canal, as these personnel would be destroyed by an HJ-08 ATGM flying in and blasting this technical full of personnel and maiming horribly other personnel on either side of it, who would eventually bleed out from their wounds from shrapnel, others being hit by fire being vectored into the area. The rest had fled behind this building and out of the area, as this building was already horribly gutted from the earlier airstrike as these personnel had entered the area. Again, very few would end up escaping the area with their lives to fight another day, which was a wise decision, as attacks also came in from the northeast side of this canal, which was the effective boundary of the landing zones on the general eastern side. The personnel that had moved into this area attacked in two prongs against this wide wedge and this wedge formation, who vectored fire together at these 7 personnel, annihilating them as they moved towards the canal, with others taking heavy fire on this prong, losing several of their 7 before they could even get in this building, and this building would take immense fire from these dismounted personnel firing rocket-propelled grenade, armor-piercing anti-armor ammunition, as well as HJ-08 ATGMs of this building, causing the few survivors to flee the area. The trucks, 2 technicals, 2 trucks that moved into this area, had a total of 4 personnel divided between each truck and 5 in the beds. The 2 trucks pulling into this area with 2 in the cab, in each cab, dismounted their 5 personnel from the back of the cab, who were promptly being lit up as they flew into this area at a high rate of speed while taking fire. They dismounted their troops, were cut down immediately as the technicals entered the area, with the technicals being lit up by 5.8 by 42 millimeter ammunition from the light machine gunner of this particular squad, while a rifleman picked off the personnel jumping out of the back, as also there was fire vectored in from this squad and even this squad as well. This grouping was destroyed instantaneously upon moving into this area, this occurring at about the same time as these personnel had fled. As they moved past this gas station here, they were absolutely destroyed as they entered this particular area. As the combat in the area would eventually calm down by 3 hours into the fighting, or effectively by 5 a.m., as the landings, or I'm sorry, 4 a.m., as the landings had occurred late within the first hour. The next hour would see a relative lull in the fighting for the time being, as these two air assault infantry marine companies held firm their positions between both canals of the I-10 bridge crossing, after having had first annihilated the technicals and personnel of these militia groups that totaled 200 attacking from, initially at least, from the southwest, with another 500 set to attack next a bit later. But by the time the 500 personnel were fleeing from outside the Port Arthur area towards this bridge would attack, this would occur at a time when the artillery had made landfall and was now moving into position with some of their batteries to be able to support operations unfolding deep in the battle space with their very powerful 122 millimeter howitzers, although these were not quite as powerful as 130 millimeter, 152, or 155, as the 152 and 155 were effectively considered heavy artillery, as there was also even calibers above that, such as the 203 millimeter, even the 170 millimeter, between the 152, 155, and the 203. The 122 millimeters, when fired in concentrated volleys at single targets, were still absolutely devastating weapons, and these would be utilized to great effect to support the operations that would now be unfolding, as the maneuver elements were effectively by this time making it ashore, and also now having had come ashore both in the north of the Sabine Lake in the form of the medium and light combined arms battalions, along with, of course, the initial recon battalion landing, which had landed first. The forces of the medium combined arms battalion, and also even the light combined arms battalion, which would play a major role in the capture and consolidation of the city of Orange, with its key objectives being the I-10 crossing into the American Southeast, as this was the literal gateway, as well as the Sabine Entergy power plant offices, and also a company of the light combined arms battalion would take the power plant itself, as they would roll in, as the power plant was by the lake and surrounded by wetlands and forests and fields, would roll in and effectively just capture the facility in a rapid fashion against its paramilitary defending forces that had been equipped with issued M250 cals as their heaviest weapons, as the other forces would sweep north of the heavy combined arms battalion, as well as the combat engineers, to clash with American logistical forces as they would fight their way through the city and to the military sites, which they would capture after heavy combat, would then seize the entire node of the city of Beaumont, through which I-10, of course, ran. This being necessary for the transit of the external invasion components of the PLA ground forces, or the PLA army, that were to move through the area later in the day en route to the American Southeast, which would effectively take them up I 10 and through Beaumont and the city of Orange and into Louisiana. As these forces, of course, would consist of Group Armies 15 through 20 minus Group Army 15, replacing the 83rd in the Houston area. The rest of the 5 group armies of the PLA ground forces or army would pass through this key node of Beaumont and also the smaller city of Orange and enter the American Southeast to support other Trojan units that were fighting in that particular battle space. As for the operations occurring in this battle space, the air assault forces would see the heaviest initial combat along with the recon forces landing to capture the Marine Services facility, which would facilitate the landings of the rest of their reconnaissance battalion, medium and light combined arms battalions, with the majority of the battalions comprising the brigade landing in the Port Arthur port, which had larger facilities and could accommodate more forces landing at a single time, which is why the brigade divided its landing zones up into 2 different areas, because it would make it faster to land more of their forces more and expedite it more efficiently. And as the support battalion would be the chief logistical battalion supporting all of the brigade's forces, their specialized cargo vessel, which dropped them off, contained hefty quantities of ammunition, food, water, fuel, and spare parts for vehicles, as these logistical and support companies that comprise the support battalion would be constantly from their positions by the shore where they could continually receive supplies from their vessel, be trucking supplies up to all the different battalions partaking in the operations. And they, as the SHORAD battalion of the brigade, would essentially have no air targets. The Yition systems would effectively now be security forces for the support battalion, as they had a heavy machine gun, typically a W-85, for self-defense, and were relatively armored vehicles. And while they carried the ground-based version of the TY-90 air defense missile, which also was an air-to-air missile too, as there was an air-to-air version, these systems had a 5.5 mile range and a 3.5 mile total altitude ceiling as a SHORAD air defense system, which was short range air defense. But due to their armored qualities and their ability to mount a heavy machine gun, these would make great escort vehicles for the supply vehicles of the support battalion to supply the artillery battalion and its comprising batteries, as well as to supply the medium and heavy combined arms battalions, as well as the light combined arms battalion, and of course supplying the recon battalion and eventually the air assault battalion, although the air assault battalion would initially receive most of their supplies through airdrops from their own transport aviation company, running circuits to and fro the Type 75 or Type 075 landing dock or helicopter carrier to bring in the battalion's supplies for the troops carrying out their missions on the ground, such as controlling the I-10 bridge in the southwest to prevent both escape from the city of American forces, as possibly the logistical forces could have abandoned their posts and tried to flee the city in different directions, although the command elements, due to the confusion caused by the intelligence forces of the coalition, namely the MSS agents of the Chinese, the ISI agents of the Pakistanis, and the Ministry of Intel agents of the Iranians, who had sowed total chaos with the planting of plastic explosives in the motor pools and on certain buildings, would cause enough chaos and pandemonium, along with the loss of communications and ISR capabilities, to cause the commanders to take extreme caution and stay in place. And this would occur long enough for them to become totally cut off by the combination of the air assault landings on the last remaining vital bridges into and out of the city, as well as the use of the recon battalion to cut off escape to the east towards Vidor, as they would race into this area as fast as possible after first conducting a flank clearance operation against a cluster of armed reactionary civilian militia type personnel, while also conducting real-time recon, as they were recon troops after all, against the actual Entergy power plant facility before their lead companies of their battalion raced towards Vidor to cut off the bridge crossing, with the follow-up companies coming from behind after reconning this area long enough for the Light Combined Arms Battalion to send one of its companies to take the power plant, while the rest would take the city of Orange and the power plant's offices within, as well as the vital segment of I-10 that traversed the city and entered into Louisiana. All of these forces were conducting various different objective operations as they captured a myriad of objectives as well as destroying others, which included American military forces and ships. The vessels at sea carried out the destruction of the shipping, while the air power, namely the VVS air power, but in some respects also the PLAAF air power, which was mostly responsible for combat air patrols and air superiority over the battlefield, would conduct a number of strikes against enemy ground targets, while the ships, while mostly initially concentrated on the threats at sea, would end up eventually firing cruise missiles to support the forces in land, as the first cruise missile support against enemy ground forces came to support the landing of the recon battalion as a single cruise missile was fired, a YJ-18A, at attacking armed civilian militia forces who met them on the coast by the Marine Services facility, as a number of U.S. Marines would actually escape their bivouac site with their lives as they were brutally assaulted by the PLAN Air Assault Battalion with its Combat Aviation Company of Z-9WA gunships, its 82mm Mortar Company for ground-based fire support, and a single platoon detachment sent to conduct a recon and force against the U.S. Marine site would see 50 surviving U.S. Marines fleeing into the woods and wetlands, swamps, and also marshes that were located to the general northwest of the battle space, as a small number would link up with another grouping of militia-type personnel numbering 500, as most of the armed reactionary civilians outside of the urban area were militia-type personnel, while those inside were just armed ordinary civilians with very little, if any, training and very poor equipment and very low quantities of ammunition carried on them. The militia-type personnel that were concentrated relatively thick in this battle space were a bit better quality than the standard armed reactionary civilians in many other places, although, again, they were simply no match for the heavy firepower of a more professional, more powerful, better trained and equipped, and also a wider array of capabilities military force, as the advent of the AI systems utilized by the coalition simply made these forces next generation forces, as this force multiplier, combat multiplier, in the form of the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, made the economization of the firepower far more efficient and far more accurate and more capable than was ever before possible without AI guidance, as all of the vectoring of firepower from the simple infantry squad all the way to the vehicle crews to the helicopter gunships to the aircraft, and even, of course, to the artillery and battleships at sea and subs, made these forces unstoppable and almost invincible, as they would suffer comparably much lower casualties than the party which was being invaded, which was the American military and armed civilian population, as the military defeat of America would be guaranteed in relatively short order due to the massive capabilities in ISR, AI, IT technology, and the total firepower dominance, as heavy firepower was concentrated in relatively small areas at different times by these very heavy forces, ensured the absolute and total destruction of any challenger that arose and tried to take on these powerful fighting forces. These PLAN Marines were effectively quasi-elite forces and were a compact fighting force. Effectively, they had a wide, broad array of capabilities just within their own brigade, which was highly impressive. So they had everything from heavy to light and very fast moving forces in some cases, with different capabilities and different arrays of firepower. As the I-10 bridge in the southwest was an absolutely vital bridge to control by the air assault Marine infantry forces, while their attack helo gunships of their combat aviation company would be primarily supporting the operations in the north due to the presence of the U.S. Marine forces, which in this battle space were the heaviest and best equipped fighting forces that the Americans had to offer in terms of ground combat, as these were the primary security force to back up the American Army logistical troops or the Navy forces, even some Coast Guard that were in this area. These Marine forces were a high priority objective to defeat, and defeat rapidly. Thus, they were targeted by two Su-34s, dropping all of their payload across the widely spread out and well dug in Marine forces, as well as also 4 different cruise missile strikes from the sea, hitting mortar pits belonging to the weapons company of the Marine 1st of the 123rd Battalion, as both the Rifle Company, which was the Alpha Company of the battalion, and the Weapons Company were interspersed together in a wide array of trench systems and foxholes, and of course, again, mortar pits for their mortar platoon of the Weapons Company. And these mortar pits were struck by cruise missile strikes and the remaining munitions aboard the 2 Su-34s designated to strike these targets, with the PLAN Marine Air Assault Infantry platoon from one of the 2 companies landed, conducting the reconnaissance in force, would sweep the area after the heavy destruction had occurred, along with the mortar strikes from their mortar company of 82mm mortars and the strikes from the Z-9WA gunships, allowing for the remaining members of the platoon that had not been KIA'd or WIA'd in the exchange with the U.S. Marines to go in and sweep up the entire area that had been bombed to total oblivion by the Su-34s, and cruise missile strikes, gunships, and mortar fires into this area. And upon having had designated the area clear, the platoon would return to their positions with the rest of their company in their bridgehead on the State Highway 96 bridge in the north, as artillery strikes would occur in this area a bit later after the artillery battalion had come ashore of the 6th Marine Brigade. These air assault troops would find themselves in combat yet again, preventing the escape of armed civilians out of the city. These armed reactionary civilians would be targeted through the ISR capabilities and real-time AI battlefield data processing system as they gathered in clusters and made themselves easy targets. The artillery strikes would be savage against all of these forces, causing them to try to flee, and they would flee into the arms of the waiting air assault Marine infantry, 82mm mortar fire backing them up, and returning Z-9WA attack helo gunships that would fly circuits through this general area to support the forces of theirs holding this area. As all of this would be occurring, of course, heavy fighting would be occurring as well for the port facilities and energy facilities, which are absolutely vital objectives for the PLAN 6th Marine Brigade. This fire would be exchanged between the remaining logistical troops of the Americans, namely their army, but also some naval logistical troops, a few Coast Guard personnel as well, and the attacking forces of the Combat Engineer Battalion and Heavy Combined Arms Battalion that would be attacking the different military sites located in the city of Beaumont itself, as they would absolutely need to clear these objectives so that they could capture them and begin to use them for their later occupation operations. These rail and port infrastructures would be absolutely vital for the transit of heavy coalition units, just as they were once used to deploy American heavy units. They would now be in the hands of the occupation forces and would be used to occupy this country and colonize it, as that was the ultimate designs of the leadership of the CCP regime. All the arable farmland and resources would be theirs. Of course, Russia would get their cut of the Arctic territories, which held even more resources and would make them exceedingly wealthy as well. But for a time, the Russian allies of the Chinese would aid them in the occupation of their occupation zone for a number of months before they would withdraw to their own territories as a gesture of goodwill, as America was a vast land, and every bit of the numbers of forces available helped in its occupation. This would also give China time to mobilize more of its forces to replace the leaving Russians and any other coalition partners that would gradually leave over time, although some, which were staunch Chinese allies like North Korea and Pakistan, would remain for the long haul. And even Belarus would stay past the Russians and some other countries as well. In the next video of this hypothetical invasion documentary series highlighting fourth-generation warfare doctrines through a Sino-Russian coalition invasion, the Combat Engineer Battalion, now fully ashore by the third hour, with the remaining battalions following behind that were now being offloaded, such as the Support Battalion, Artillery Battalion, and SHORAD Battalion, as the Combat Engineer Battalion would now be fully ashore by the third hour, as would the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion, would essentially wait for all of the battalions to arrive ashore by hour 5 before setting off to the north alongside of the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion's forces, operating alongside of them, parallel to them on their flanks, effectively as the left flank of the Combat Engineer advance would be covered by the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion sweeping in with them to the north, would have to cross a canal whose canal bridges had been left intact for this purpose, and would end up being attacked on both of its flanks by a number of armed civilians, effectively around 200 on either side. And this would result in heavy combat, with the now fully landed artillery battalion participating in conducting massive artillery strikes, as virtually the whole battalion initially would take part in this before expanding their fire missions to other areas of the battle space, along with heavy Su-34 strikes and their own heavy firepower being used to repel these forces, as the combat engineers were exceedingly well armed, including with high technology weapons such as armed combat robots, which functioned as mobile heavy machine gun platforms that were small and nimble enough to get into areas where vehicles, of course, couldn't go. They had FPV drone operators, and of course, the single tube versions of the CH-901A loitering munitions, which were even more powerful than FPV drones. And all of these technologies linked together through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, along with the vehicles operated by the combat engineers, which included mine clearance vehicles, which could also devastate other types of fortifications and personnel, as these were plastic explosive line charges, rocket-guided, which were devastating on everything from clearing a mine path through a minefield to destroying fortifications. They, of course, also had their infantry fighting vehicle versions of these EBD-05s within each platoon, and the combat engineers would utilize their wide array of heavy firepower, even their small DJI track-based demolition robots, similar to those used by the PLA ground forces or Army, to absolutely demolish these enemy personnel, along with the heavy artillery fire and the air strikes coming in from the Russian allies of the VVS within the coalition. As the coalition forces in the area not only included a Russian strike aircraft squadron from the VVS, but also a Russian refueling aircraft, the IL-78, which provided fuel to all three squadrons operating in the area, the Su-34 squadron and the two J-10 squadrons. There would be alternating IL-78s in this area. One would run out of fuel to provide for the fighters, another would come in to replace it, as this one would return to base on its RTB to obtain more fuel, and fuel for itself, of course, for the flight, and any needed maintenance procedures, as these aircraft to be kept well supplied and kept in the air for a number of hours until they ran out of munitions or they needed to conduct an RTB to rearm, primarily with more air-to-ground munitions. The IL-78s would be absolutely essential to the overall aviation operations of this battle. As the next video will highlight the canal crossing operation outside of the city of Port Arthur, moving towards the city of Beaumont by the combat engineers, the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion would receive no resistance on its drive up the state highway of 98 into the city. More to come in the next video.